On the cloud. You make sure, yes, we are recording. Okay, I just wanted to make sure because last thing I want to do is not have this recorded. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Catherine Connors. I am one of the team leads and newly appointed openness specialist with Adopt4Life. And I have the honor for to host this webinar, introduce Mary Jo, do some of the techie stuff here. My internet, I hope, isn't going to be lagging. They were working on it today, so I hope it'll work throughout. So if you're good, we can kind of get started.
Sure.
Okay. Well, okay, there we go. So welcome. So I took a look at the list of people who were registered. So we have people from all gamuts who've been touched by adoption. So awaiting parents, getting ready, a couple of professionals, I want to say our more seasoned parents, people who've been there, who've been on a few of our webinars. So I always love having new faces, new names coming in, as well as obviously the people who know webinars and how they work. So welcome to everybody. If you're seeing this on replay as well, welcome to you. Everybody who may come in late, or if you're on now and you have to leave early, absolutely fine. I'm going to be emailing you a copy of this webinar, so you feel free to go back and listen to parts that you need to. We really want this to be an interactive webinar, so sharing your questions, or if you have something to add to the conversation, please feel free. I have a school behind me, and so you might hear a lot of, I think there's like a basketball game going on, so if you hear screaming behind me, everything is fine. It's just there's kids going crazy behind me. So this is obviously the second part to the series. We've already had a couple questions about part one. If you are seeing this and you realize that you have not seen part one, please feel free to email me. I've included my email down below, or Facebook me, and I will send you a copy of it. Hopefully I've gotten the kinks out of accessing that as well. So how do you ask questions on these webinars? We cannot see or hear you, so do not worry about any background noise you might have. It's just on our lovely end that we need to be careful with what you see and hear. So you'll see that there's a question and answer box on your screen. That's a place for you to be able to ask questions, whether as we go along, or if you want to wait to ask your questions, please feel free. There's the option to ask a question anonymously, so you'll be able to type in if you are concerned with people knowing who's asking the question. We also have the chat, which I know some of you have already been using that option. So chat is a great place for us to, again, you can ask questions from here. You can direct a question or comment towards one specific person. So feel free to use both areas. I'm going to be monitoring that both, so Mary Jo can be focusing on presenting and getting all her amazing thoughts and inspirations and guidance out to all of us. If there is a technical problem, so if you can't hear Mary Jo, she's talking too fast, or we're cutting in and out, or who and the whatnot, the raise hand button is a really good function, and so that's a way to get our attention right away. So perhaps if you've asked a question and we've moved on a few slides and you still haven't had your question answer, please raise the button, raise your hand button, and I'll stop the show, so to speak, and then this way we can make sure that whatever needs to be addressed will be addressed. Finally, how to get more support. So after this webinar, if you're finding that you do need more support, please reach out to your parent liaison, reach out to us here at Adopt4Life. Mary Jo, we are so honored that she is actually a lead of our mental health committee, so we do have access to her. So if we need to bug her some more, we can do that. Obviously, Mary Jo is a professional in the field, so if you're finding that you might need a bit more in-depth services, we absolutely would recommend her as well for ongoing therapeutic supports. So that's my spiel. I try and condense it as much as possible because I feel like I say the same things over and over. So let's get into the meat and potatoes. I'm going to introduce Mary Jo to you, and then we can get going. If I can click the button. There we go. So this is big. Every time I read this, I feel I'm like honored to be sharing the screen with you. But Mary Jo is a very experienced, well-educated psychotherapist who has been supporting those touched by adoption and trauma for many years. She does have her private practice, which I talked about, but she also is part of the Adoption Council of Ontario, or the ACO, with their PACT program. So I think the Permanency and Adoption Competency Trainer. That's a good title, actually. And like I said, she is the chair of our mental health committee here with Adopt4Life. She works with war-affected children in both Canada as well as internationally. And on top of all of this, she is a parent, and she's a parent through adoption and with openness. So I think that's, oh, I'm sorry, everybody. Sorry. Okay, good night. Sorry. So me, I don't like talking about myself. It's so strange to talk about myself. So I am an adoptive mom of 3. My kids are 8, 6, and 3. My 3-year-old made the cameo appearance, and that was my 6-year-old just interrupting us. So my background is in special needs, more specifically in the autism field. I'm also a social worker and now have lived experience with raising children with special needs. All 3 of my children have all 3 levels of openness. So going through mediation, the courts, openness agreements, that's where my experience comes from, as well as things with funding forms, supporting families. That's who I am. I'm also doing all of our social media and webinars, so you will see my face and name everywhere. So hopefully you don't get too bored of me, because I'm all over the place. So that's our kind of mini introductions. If everybody is good with that, I'm going to get right into the webinar, and I'm going to put myself on mute and let you take over if that's okay.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, I'm muting myself.
Well, hello and welcome everyone. I'm so glad you were able to take the time out of your beautiful summer evening and come and join us this evening. If you were able to see the first webinars in this series on attachment, this one will be a little bit different. The last one was a little bit more from the heart, and this one is a little bit more, well, it's a little bit more didactic. We have to learn a few things right now. So we're going to be discussing the different terms that people use around attachment and trauma, and just what are all these terms and what do they mean, and where are we going with these terms, you know, reactive attachment disorder and other things. And then we're going to talk about, and getting those terms kind of clear in your mind is really important, because different people use different terms for different things. And I think it's really important to know what the terms are all about. We're going to talk a little bit about parenting to enhance attachment and to resolve trauma. I'm going to talk about arousal and affect, or emotions, and identity a little bit. And then we're going to talk about the effects of attachment challenges on parental bonding. We'll talk a bit about resources, and then we'll have hopefully the last. I would really like, I'm really okay if people interrupt. I'm really okay if we actually don't finish. We're going to have another one in this series, and if we don't finish this topic tonight, I'll just add it to the next one. So if people have a question, please ask it at the time, okay? I know we'll still have more questions and discussion at the end, and that's okay too. But just, you know, ask that question right away when you have it. Okay, Catherine. All right, so we're going to talk about several different terms and the terms that we use. So in the medical world, or in the psychiatric world, there are only 2 different diagnostic terms that you can use for an attachment disorder. And so in the psychiatric world, there is something called the DSM, and it's a Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, And we're currently on the 5th edition. So every 10 years, they make a new DSM, a new Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. So the right now, the DSM-5 is about 2 years old, and there used to be just, in the DSM-4, there was reactive attachment disorder. In DSM-3, there wasn't even anything to do with attachment. So attachment is new, and attachment disorder is very new. It's only been in this one and the last DSMs. So it's only been there for about the last 12 years. Before that, like the first time I ever saw a child with a diagnosis was probably 2004, 2003 was the first time I ever saw the diagnosis. So it's a very, very new diagnosis. We're only just beginning to understand it. And so last DSM-4, there was one diagnostic category. Now there are two. We're going to talk about those two. Unfortunately, another term didn't get into the DSM-5, although many people in the field where I work had tried to get a new term in, which is called developmental trauma. We're really hoping it'll be in DSM-6. And so then we're just going to talk generally about attachment difficulties. That you know, what are you seeing when people haven't really had a formal diagnosis yet? So the first diagnosis. So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor, and a psychiatrist can only use diagnoses that are in the DSM. Those are the diagnostic terms that they're allowed to use. So they're left with only two possibilities. The first one is reactive attachment disorder. And reactive attachment disorder is, according to the DSM, and this is from page 265 to 266, and basically just copied out what they've said, you know, a little bit of a variation in the wording, but mostly this is what they say, is it's basically about an inhibited, emotionally withdrawn behavior towards adults. So it's a child that doesn't go to seek or accept from adults comfort when they're distressed. So it's really about a child who doesn't use the nurturing adults in their environment to go to for comfort, or when comfort is offered, they don't accept it. And that's really what reactive attachment disorder is, the hallmark of it. And so according to reactive attachment disorder, they're more withdrawn, there's more minimal social engagement, and there's minimal emotional responsiveness. Their positive affect is more or less absent, so they have more negative affect. In the negative ranges, sadness, more withdrawn, irritability, and fearfulness. And they have a history of neglect, emotional and social, perhaps medical neglect. And they have a history of multiple caregivers or institutional rearing. And that this is seen in the child before they're 5 years old, not necessarily that the doctor has seen them before they were 5, but that people in their life have seen this behavior before the child was 5. And it can't be diagnosed before the child is 9. It has to be persistent for more than 12 months because it can't be just a short-term thing, you know, like an intermittent depression that a child might have. And that usually serious social neglect with poor caregiving is the only known cause. So that there can't be other things that have happened in the child's life other than social neglect and poor caregiving that would be the cause, okay? So the other diagnosis that is available in the DSM is disinhibited social engagement disorder. So again, this one wasn't in DSM-4. This one's only in DSM-5. This is a fairly new one, so you're just going to start to see it. Psychiatrists, you know, once the new DSM comes out, psychiatrists have to get, and doctors have to get familiar with the new diagnoses. So I'm starting to see this diagnostic term category come through when assessments of the children that I work with. And so in this one, it's the other one is characterized by withdrawal from adults, and this one is characterized by sort of an overly engaged, disinhibited social engagement with adults. This is the child that goes to anyone. This is the child that doesn't have any wariness of strangers, and they'll be really overtly friendly with strange adults. They'll sit on their laps, they'll hug them, tell them they love them. When they walk away from the parent, they don't sort of keep an eye, where's my mommy, where's my parent. They don't keep an eye, and they would just willingly go off with any other adult. And it can't be due to an ADHD style impulsiveness. And also the child must have experienced social and emotional neglect within the caregiving environment, and that they've had repeated changes in caregivers or institutional care. And again, the child has to be at least 9 months old, and it has to be persistent for 12 months. So I'm not quite sure how that works, but they're not going to get this diagnosis until they're at least 12 months old. So in my world, those two diagnostic categories aren't good enough. They don't cover the range of symptoms that we see, and it doesn't provide help for children in all of the areas where the children that I work with and the people who've been doing the kind of work that I do, with the help that the children need in the various areas where they're struggling. So what we know is that children who've had trauma of any kind, whether that is neglect, whether that is abuse, whether that is exposure to toxins, prenatally and in the first 3 years of life, where they've had separation from their caregivers, multiple caregivers, and generally a pathological caregiving environment, the impact on the child of trauma and neglect in the first 9 months of life prenatally and in the next 3 years of life in child development, if that caregiving environment is pathological, neglect, abuse, medical neglect, frightening, then the child's brain has developed in a very kind of pathological environment, and the child's brain adapts to that environment. And so the outcome is a brain that has been adapted to a not very good situation. And so when children's brain adapt, and it's really a very brain-based and very body-based changes that are quite persistent in the child now, and quite resistant to change, actually. So many people, and mostly starting with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is in Boston, in about 2003, they wrote a paper, and they called it complex trauma. Now mostly people are calling it developmental trauma, because complex trauma doesn't actually imply that this is happening because trauma happening while the brain is developing. So the folks at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in Boston, and that includes Bessel van der Kolk and the people that he works with, Spinazzola and Cook and various other people, big team, they came up with this term, and they said that impairment that the outcome of having lived the first 9 months plus the first 3 years in an environment that is really pathological, we see impairment in 7 different domains. And so these are the domains: attachment, biology, emotional. Affect is another word for emotion. We talk about emotions, but affect is really the immediate presentation. So my affect right now is fairly neutral. I'm using a lot of my prefrontal cortex because I'm thinking, I'm highly verbal. So my affect is pretty neutral right now. Although I feel pretty happy because it's neutral, but shading towards positive, because I really like doing these kinds of webinars, and I really like teaching. I really like talking to parents, and I'm not nervous. So I'm sliding towards a positive affect. So affect is really the presentation right now. And so when you can't regulate your affect, it means that you have really volatile, changeable, rapidly changing kinds of emotions that are presenting in the moment. So it's an affect. Dissociation is when you lose touch with the present, and you get disconnected from the present in your mind. Behavioral control. If you can't control your emotions and your affect, then what will happen is that your behavior will be equally dysregulated and out of your own control. cognition, we see changes in cognition, and we see changes in self-concept. So because these domains of impairment, you can see how, oh, and I forgot biology, sorry. I might have just mentioned it. So we're going to go through each one of these a little bit, because I think it's really important that most times when people see the broad range of possible areas where their child has some impairment, it's obviously not every one of these domains is impaired, and not everyone is impaired to the same degrees. Sometimes some things are impaired more, others are impaired less. So we'll just, we'll just go through them and see what each one of these really means. And attachment is always listed first. Are you going to, thank you. Oh, okay, so go back one, there we go. So I talked a little bit about this. It's always about neglect, abuse, witness to intimate partner violence, which is about being frightened. It's about the primary caregiver or the caregiver environment is a source of trauma and neglect. And it's also through loss of primary caregivers, sequential caregivers, or inadequate caregiving, such as in institutions and in times of war, when parents are frightened and children are frightened, and their parents can't help the children not to be frightened because the parents are very frightened, then the children all experience trauma without the comfort of their parents, and in things like ethnic cleansing. So chronic trauma during early development without access to secure attachment for protection is really what causes developmental trauma. And in these 7 domains, we always put attachment first, because attachment is the first thing that we need to work on in order to be able to work on the rest of it. Because if the child doesn't trust an adult and be able to go to an adult for comfort and security, then the child is isolated and unreachable to work on with all of the other difficulties. So what we see in attachment are difficulties with boundaries. So that would be that disinhibited type, where kids don't have any personal boundaries and they go and sit on the laps of strangers. We also see the distrust. So they don't trust the adults around them to be safe. They don't trust the adults around them to meet their needs. And so from this distrust or mistrust, they really feel isolated. And so because of that, because they're isolated, that they don't look to people, they don't watch people as much. Well, they might be wary of people, but they don't engage with them as much. They end up not learning how to do that. And so they have interpersonal difficulties knowing and understanding other people's emotional states and what other people might be thinking about. So their ability to engage in relationships in a reciprocal way, and to have empathy and what we call theory of mind, understanding other people's thoughts, these things are compromised. So we have to work on attachment first before we can begin to work through the other things. So the next one is biology. And so, sorry, I should have put, I forgot. This is the reference, and I meant to put it on all of these slides, and I meant to go back and copy and paste. So Cook et al. Is the reference for each one of these slides on developmental trauma. And so if anybody would like to read, there's a short 11-page paper that was published in Annals of Psychiatry in 2005, and there's the larger white paper that was published in 2003. I'd be happy to send that to Catherine, and then you can email Catherine to get the full papers if you're really interested in this, because these papers really form the foundation. They're sort of the seminal papers on developmental trauma. So anyway, biology, we know that when kids have a lot of trauma, when they suffer from experiences that are frightening, it changes their biology. And so they end up having difficulties with sensory motor developmental problems, sensory processing problems, the sensation of pain. Many of you will be nodding your head saying, yes, my child gets hurt and they don't feel any pain. And they may have problems in coordination, body tone, balance. Somatization means that when they get nervous, instead of saying I'm nervous, which would be asking for help, they say I have a tummy ache. So making the emotional and psychological states more reflected in a body state, headaches, stiff muscles, stomach ache. Those are the common ones. And increased physical health problems. We know that children from the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that if you have early trauma, then the more early trauma you have, the more different kinds of early trauma that you have, the more lifelong risk to your health you will have. So it's very important for long-term health. And the next one is affect regulation. So children who have early developmental trauma are not able to regulate their emotions. They have difficulty labeling and understanding and expressing their feelings. So they have a hard time knowing when they're upset or mad or sad or angry or scared. They have a hard time putting words to what's going on inside, because frankly, that just teaching that, just saying that hasn't been happening for them because it was a less than optimal caregiving situation. They have a hard time knowing their internal states, maybe have a hard time understanding even when they're sick, saying when they're sick, knowing that they're sick, and difficulty communicating wants and needs. And that goes back perhaps again to the mistrust and the distrust of the adults around them. So if they don't expect to have their needs met, why would they communicate those needs? And dissociation is when there's an alteration in the states of consciousness. It doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be as severe as saying that a child has two different presentations as in a multiple identity. That's very rare, actually. But what does happen is that people kind of, even we all have states of dissociation as you're going to sleep. And your mind starts to wander. But before you're actually asleep, sometimes you get wakened before you're actually asleep, but you realize that you've already gone off into kind of a la-la land. That's a dissociative state. It's perfectly normal. So that you weren't really here and now in the present. Your mind was somewhere else, but you weren't really aware that your mind was somewhere else until somebody kind of wakes you up before you've actually fallen asleep. You weren't all the way into a sleep state. So that happens. However, children sometimes can do that if their world is too frightening. They can go away in their mind. And so that's what we sometimes think about as a dissociation. And of course, if you've gone away in your mind, you won't know what's happening in the present, and you won't remember what's happening in the present, so you get amnesia. Depersonalization and derealization depersonalization is feeling not yourself. It's kind of like feeling altered, feeling like you're in some kind of altered state. And derealization is kind of feeling like you're behind a glass wall and the world is happening over there and you're not really part of it, and you feel a little bit separate. And we know this from people who are adults who are able to much more clearly describe these states, but children have them too, but they just certainly don't know how to describe them. But if you're watching very carefully, you can sometimes see them. And so if you're derealizing and depersonalizing, you may have an altered state of memory for the current events. And so if all of these things are happening, you're not able to go to adults for help and security, then what really happens? So then what happens is that you haven't learned from your caregiver in the first 3 years of life, you haven't learned that when you get upset, you go to the adult for help, and that adult will help soothe you, and that everything will be okay. So what happens instead is you get upset about something. You could be hungry, you could have hurt yourself, you could be scared. And so there's no adult to go to. So instead that feeling just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it's horrible. And so then you get into this state of crying or shutting down completely and just checking out. But it's an overwhelming state. So children who've lived in a very pathological environment have way too often been overwhelmed by their experiences. And so they just have a huge range of experiences within themselves, and therefore their body is showing and communicating what they're feeling. And of course, people around them don't like that. So you have an already pathological environment. The child is really crying hard, not being soothed. And so that's likely to rain down even worse things upon you. And so you have to do something else. You get into pathological self-soothing behaviors. If you're frightened, you can't go to sleep. If you're frightened, you can't eat. As you get older, you may use substances like marijuana. Marijuana is a big problem for a lot of my teenager clients right now because it's becoming more and more available. And so, to help raise your affective state, because you've got too much negative affect and you want more positive affect, you get into using substances to create that instead of relationships. And other things that happen is that kids can be excessively compliant, so they don't get frightened, and because they're frightened of their caregiver, or that they are identifying with people who have power, and they may use power and may be very oppositional. And so, cause and effect is very poorly understood in children who've had chaotic environments. And so rules are all about this, then this, this, then this. And so that's cause and effect, cause and effect. And cause and effect is really compromised in children who've had a chaotic and frightening environment. And sometimes we see reenactment of trauma in their behavior and in their play. Oh, and so then we also have this long, long list of difficulties with cognition. Because children have been focusing on survival, focusing on getting their needs met, and their emotions and their midbrain has taken over so that they can survive in this pathological environment, then what happens is that the prefrontal cortex doesn't have a chance to be exercised. Who cares about learning your ABCs if what you really need to do is figure out how to get the Cheerios box open so that you're not starving, right? Who cares about, learning how the world works if you're hiding in your bedroom? How are you going to learn about how the world works if you're locked in the closet? So we have all of these cognitive sequelae or fallout symptoms, whatever word you want to use. So kids can't regulate their attention if they're on high alert and hyper wary. They're scanning the environment all the time for safety. And we have what looks like something like attention deficit. They don't attend to one thing, they attend to everything. We have problems in executive functioning, and that's basically the brain's operating system. And if you have compromised executive functioning, that means you're going to be compromised in your student skills. Life skills too, but mostly it shows up for kids in school when they have to organize things and plan their time and plan their materials and attend to one thing and shift from subject to subject to subject. And these things are all about executive functioning. And these are really hard for the kids that I work with. Lack of sustained curiosity. Curiosity is about learning. We don't learn without curiosity. And we're not going to be curious about a world that is frightening. That's really what it boils down to. We want to protect ourselves from a world that's scary. Processing information is difficult. Focusing and completing tasks is very difficult if you're constantly scanning the environment. Object constancy. If everything in your life keeps changing, if people keep disappearing, if nothing is predictable, then you don't really get the idea that if somebody walks out the door, that they still exist. Too many people in their lives have walked out the door and never come back. So many children have a hard time with knowing that if I can't see you, you're still there and you still love me, right? Difficulty with planning, anticipating, understanding responsibilities, learning difficulties, language difficulties, time and space difficulties. So, and then the next one is self-concept. So if you're operating like this in the world and you go from this pathological environment where you really can't be close to very many people because they may be dangerous, they may be scary, they may be mean, unpredictable, and then you come out into the world where you're exposed to other people who are really very different, people who are kind, people who are functioning really well, other kids in your class, you start to realize that you're really very different. And that other people find certain things easy and you find them incomprehensible. and confusing. I think confusion is a huge part of what goes on for children, little children especially. And so they really don't understand about themselves and about others and about individual, I'm me and you're you and we're separate, but we can be together. So they don't really get any of those things. And self-esteem is hugely impacted, and more shame than guilt. And the next one. So just before we go on to this, I mean, I wonder if you can just think about going back now to the two diagnostic terms from the DSM, and then think about your children and think about, well, you know, which term, developmental trauma with its 7 domains of impairment that we will look at each domain as we help the children. I mean, to me, there's no comparison. Those other 2 diagnostic terms don't help us. They really don't help us, other than say the kid's got a diagnosis. Great, thanks. But this term developmental trauma really does help us. It really helps to understand that it's brain-based. It helps us to understand what we can do about it. And it helps people like teachers and neighbors and grandparents to really understand how this child is impaired in their brain development, and that what adoption and what a good nurturing relationship does is it allows their brain to redevelop. Granted, it takes longer, but to redevelop in a healthy way, in a healthy relationship. So now, because this is so important, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Developmental Trauma Action Alliance, DTAA. So this is a group of professionals. There's 35 or 40 professionals and parents who've come together who really want developmental trauma to become, in Ontario, the term that people understand and use.
Sorry, can you just explain DTAA? There's just one more question. If you can just re-explain that.
Yeah, Developmental Trauma Action Alliance. It's this group of people, and we've just come together this year. We've just started. It's being headed by Kathy Soden at the ACO, the Adoption Council of Ontario, and she's the one who's running the PACT program, the Permanency and Adoption Competency Training. So many acronyms. So we've just come together. We have a small grant, and we're looking to go for a bigger, collective impact grant to really have developmental trauma become part of the way we see things. And this fall, we'll be having roundtables across the province to have discussions about developmental trauma. So we're using this definition of developmental trauma, which I think is an excellent definition. Significant adverse childhood experiences, particularly in the first 3 years of life, can lead to profound changes in our brain and body that put people at risk. Our brains have evolved to respond and adapt to stressful experiences as a necessary survival mechanism. These adaptations can undermine healthy development and become damaging patterns or blueprints that determine lifelong relationships, mental and physical health, learning, living, and parenting. We call this process and its impacts developmental trauma. We now know what helps, but too often developmental trauma goes unrecognized and unaddressed. As a society, we must do better at identifying, understanding, and healing developmental trauma in children, in adults hurt as children, and in families and communities where developmental trauma has become intergenerational. So this to me is the way that we see the whole picture of the whole child, their past, their parents' past, and how we can help going forward to help this child and to improve things for the next generation. And frankly, I really don't believe that those 2 diagnostic terms from the DSM are helpful in this way. So that's my soapbox. So does anybody have any other questions about that?
I don't think so. I don't see anything.
Okay. So I'd love, even if you don't have a question, I'd love it if you just made a comment about what you think about kind of those 2 DSM categories, diagnostic terms, and how, some of us are using developmental trauma as a lens, as a framework, and whether you thought that would be helpful for the child or children that you're parenting or know about.
Someone's asking where they might get more info on the DTAA.
Go to the Adoption Council of Ontario website. Go to the tab that says Programs, go down that list, and you will see Developmental Trauma Action Alliance, and that Developmental Trauma Action Alliance page will come up. And we're just loading in the dates of the roundtables that are going around the province. The first one will be in the GTAA. Then we have Barrie, then we have North Bay, then we have Ottawa, London, Thunder Bay. There's another one in there somewhere, but I've forgotten. Kitchener, maybe. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have maybe more of a comment. So it's so helpful to understand the 7 domains. Thank you for the detailed explanation, Mary Jo. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just go on now. So just overall, when you think about those different domains, you realize in how many different areas you will need to help your child. But we do know, and this is why this is an attachment webinar, we do know that we have to work on the attachment piece first. But when I work on the attachment piece first with parents and children together, I have to have the parents knowledgeable about all of the other domains so that the parent understands why the child is behaving the way they're behaving and why just typical parenting doesn't work. So can we go to the next slide? Because I want to have lots of time to talk about this a little bit. So the other category and diagnostic term that I see a lot is attachment difficulties. Nobody has, either they don't qualify for all of those categories that are under the DSM, one or the other, or maybe it looks like both, or maybe it's much more complicated than that, or they haven't been to see a psychiatrist, or everyone is suspecting that they're going to get a diagnosis that just doesn't happen yet, or they just wouldn't fit those 2 diagnostic categories because lots of children who have attachment difficulties don't. Then the psychiatrist is stuck with just saying, well, they have attachment difficulties. And so, okay. And so what we mean by that is that the child has experienced disruptions of attachment, that they've compromised in their trust, and they have difficulty seeking and accepting comfort, help, and nurture from their caregivers, that the child may be indiscriminately friendly with adults who are not parents, and that they have problems with self-regulation, and they have problems with self-concept. So it's trust, regulation, and there's a history. Really, those are the things that we really look at. Okay, so when we're parenting children with developmental trauma, and I said this in the last webinar, and I can't say it enough times, is what was broken in a relationship can only be mended in a relationship. It is the relationship that heals. So if we do not help children to come into a relationship that will enable them to have an attachment relationship and move towards a secure attachment, they will not have healing from their developmental trauma. And it might be that if they don't get help, that they might need have an intimate partner who doesn't have developmental trauma, who has a more secure attachment history. And as an adult, they will do their work and find intimacy with another adult and be able to develop that trust, and they will heal from their developmental trauma. They may then, go in and do some deeper work with some therapy, and, as an adult, they may be able to be healed from the developmental trauma from their childhood. If that doesn't happen, likely the cycle will be repeated. And this is what we really want to stop. So this looks like a really complicated diagram. And if you, I'm going to go through it. I'm just looking careful of the time here, but at the end, I'm going to tell you where to go and look at this in a video. And I have a series of videos on my website because there are many things that I tell every parent that I'm working with. And so I decided that it would be really great if I did a really good job of telling the story that I need to say to every parent, and then just record it. So that's what I've done. And so I have taken a couple of concepts. Well, I've taken one concept from Stephen Porges and Pat Ogden, and I can give you those references if you like, about the window of tolerance. And so basically, if you look at this blue line, the blue vertical line, at the top it says high arousal, and at the bottom it says low arousal. So at any given moment, you have an arousal level. Every single person has an arousal level. It's now 8:45. Maybe you've been parenting all day. Maybe you've been working all day. Maybe you've been doing both all day. And maybe you're getting pretty tired. So your arousal level is maybe getting low. And however, if the fire alarm rang and there was, an emergency right now, your arousal level would shoot right up to the top. So arousal level is a state within your body, and it has to do with fear. So at the very top is the fight, flight, freeze response, and at the very bottom is the shutdown response. And in that yellow box is where we normally function. So sometimes we're a little bit up and we're having a great time, we're socializing and excited and having a good time. And sometimes we're a little bit low because we're getting tired and it's getting towards the end of the day. Okay, so that's the y-axis. You can see that. That's the vertical line is the y-axis, the up and down line. Now the other line, the horizontal blue line, is the x-axis. And that's the line that considers whether or not you're in a positive emotional state or you're in a negative emotional state. So towards the positive emotional state, you're going to have happy, excited, and towards the negative emotional states, you're going to have more sad, angry, and fearful. But really, those two things need to be put together because we can have high arousal, happy. And so you can see a picture there. That's my son with my grandson, and he's tossing my grandson up and down in the air. They're having a really happy time. So the arousal level is pretty high, but also the emotion is also quite positive. So they're kind of at the top right-hand corner of that yellow box. Does that seem pretty clear? So there's lots of arousal and lots of positive emotions, but not too much. So once you cross that red line, you get into too silly, too excited, too high arousal, right? And you get past that red line, and then it's too much. That's called dysregulation. So now we've got too much arousal, or too much positive emotions, and we're dysregulated. Yes, that's right. Catherine just said, my son lives past the red line all the time. Right. So now let's go down below that picture of my son and my grandson, and let's go down there to my daughter-in-law and the baby. And of course, you can tell just by looking at that picture, arousal level is low, but they're calm and they're resting and they're peaceful. And so they're able to sleep. And so sleep is kind of at the lower right-hand corner of the yellow. Still in control, not out of control, not dysregulated, just calm and peaceful down towards that right-hand corner. If we go up into the high arousal, negative emotions, we get rage and we get fear. Outside that red line, rage and fear, where you can see where that child is hugely upset, very frightened, very distraught. Inside that yellow box this is when we get hungry and irritable, worried, a little bit angry, still in control, but we're allowed to have negative emotions. That's okay, but still in control, not dysregulated. And down below that, in the lower left corner, we get negative emotions and low arousal like being bored, being sad. And if we go even farther down, we get depression and shutdown. Is there anybody that needs more explanation about that? Does that seem understandable?
We do have a question about the slide previously.
Okay.
If you're okay if I can ask
Yeah.
that. So someone's asking, can an adult with trauma be healed by having a child? Our daughter is very strongly attached to her son, but has problems attaching to adults.
Sorry, say the question again.
Yeah. Can an adult with trauma be healed by having a child? Our daughter is very strongly attached to her son, but has problem attaching to adults.
So I don't quite get, is this the grandmother who's asking the question?
I think so. So from the sounds of it is someone has a child who they've adopted. Oh yes, grandmother here. So they have a child, she's answering back. So I guess a child who she's adopted is strongly attached to her own child, but not to them. I hope I'm answering that right. So yes, it's grandmother.
Okay, and can the parent be healed by having a child? Is that right?
We adopted our daughter as an adult and has a very traumatic background, yes. And then she then had her own child and has a strong attachment to her child, but still has difficulties with adults.
Right. So if she has the support to be a good parent, she's learning she may be also getting modeling from the good healthy parents around her, the modeling on how to interact with the baby. So now she's starting to learn reciprocity. She's starting to learn and think about and probably really dive deep into her own issues about what she missed, right? So long as she's not being triggered into her old stuff by the child, and that she has enough support that if she is, that the child isn't experiencing it, that she has other adults to go to, yes, then, and that's, I mean, I think that families should be adopted. I mean, that children are being removed mostly from parents who never had help. And so we're breaking the cycle, but, often those parents go on to have more children. If we actually helped by adopting the whole family, as a society, we could just adopt whole families. That might work too. So I think, yes, but we have to model what is the really good nurturing experience and then help that parent feel it. And they're going to start developing all that reciprocity and all those connections in their brain that they didn't have. Yeah.
Perfect. And we have one more. Oh, someone just saying they find the X and Y axis clear. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So in the yellow box is in control, regulated, able to use your thinking brain, and the misbehavior that you're going to see is probably won't. And you can use more typical parenting. Once the child is outside that red line, they are in a dysregulated state. You need to know where they are on this XY graph. Too high arousal, too low arousal, too positive, too negative emotions. Think about where they are. And if they're outside that red line, and by the way, for children with developmental trauma, that box is really small. It's really small. They spend very little time. And our job is to widen the box. And so if they're outside the red line, you're using therapeutic parenting. And I can't simplify what I do any more than that diagram. When I meet a child, and actually when I meet any parent too, I'm assessing what is their arousal level, what is their affect range, right? And I'm watching changes in arousal level and changes in affect valence. So valence is positive to negative to positive, right? I'm watching those things change as I interact with people. I'm watching them change as they interact with each other. And I'm seeing what causes the changes. I'm seeing what causes them to go higher arousal, what helps them to come down? What causes them to go low? What helps them to come back up? Where do they go to positive emotions? Where do they go into negative emotions? What is the parental response? Does it work or does it send them farther? And this is the mental model that I use when I'm working with parents. And so all of those 7 domains, when so many things are going wrong in a child's life, it sends them out the window, outside that window. And only the attachment system helps them to come back in. And really, that's kind of simplifies it as much as I can. And if we, often I will draw this diagram for people and I say, just put this on your fridge or go watch the video many times so that you really have a sense of it. What is your child's arousal level? Your child is never going to go to sleep if their arousal level is above, the blue line. They have to drop their arousal level down enough to go to sleep.
We do have a question asking, what does therapeutic parenting mean?
So therapeutic parenting means understanding the impact of your child's developmental history and parenting in a way that understands their brain and their body. It doesn't use behavior or consequences. It uses relationship and mostly your face, your body. We can go to the next slide because that kind of explains it. So just regulation is key. You can't get your child, I'll come back to that question. You can't get your child into that yellow box unless you're in the yellow box. So you have to be where you want your child to be and bring them to you, right? So if you're upset, you will never get your child re-regulated. Only a regulated parent can re-regulate a dysregulated child. It's kind of my little mantra. Okay, next one. All right, so how do I re-regulate? And this is all about this therapeutic parenting. You'll see in here that there's nothing to do with behavior and consequences. Behavior and consequences work only when the child is in the yellow box, only when they are regulated. We have to do different things to help them re-regulate. So if they're up too high, positive or negative, in terms of emotions, we use touch. Now, if we have big attachment problems, sometimes we can't touch our children. They won't allow us to touch them when they're upset. First goal in therapy, we have to start helping this child allow comforting touch. If they don't allow comforting touch, our main tool has been taken away, and we really start to work hard. Even if sometimes I just say, can you get your child just to touch fingertips? Can you touch, then we'll progress to, can you get your child just to touch hands like this? Can we get some touch? Can we get 2 hands? Can we get hands on face? Can we get hands on arms? Can we get hands around body? So we go very progressive, right? Your voice. So thinking about, I'm going to take my glasses off here for a minute. So this face and this voice is very deep and very stern. And if you're talking to your child about their behavior, then they're going to be quite alarmed. But if you open your face and you lift your eyebrows and you raise your voice and you kind of talk in that motherese, we call it, the kind of that voice that we talk with children, it's not threatening. This is threatening. This is completely different. And it doesn't really matter what I'm saying. I can say the same things, but if I change my face and change my voice, that's what the child is feeling and interpreting no matter what we say. It's the face and the voice. So we have to be highly aware. Very, the children who have lived with dangerous people, this is potentially dangerous. This is not. This has come to me, right? So we have to be very, very, very aware of what our body is, what our body is doing, what our face is doing, and we have to be very aware of what our breath is doing, because their bodies monitor our bodies. So their body is monitoring our body's arousal level. If we're starting to talk with little breath, I sound very frightened right now, don't I? So the way that we breathe, right? If we're taking good long breaths, which is why we sing. So if we're singing a song, we're taking big breaths in and singing big breaths out. And that kind of breathing really helps kids. Nobody sings with their children if they're threatening. And so singing is really like Five Little Ducks, yes. So singing is really, really helpful. If your child's distressed in the car, sometimes singing really helps. My grandson, who's very sensory sensitive, if I sing sometimes when he's upset, no singing, Gran. So I have to find something else, right? Because he's auditorily very sensitive when he's upset. Other times singing is just fine. So the other thing that we want to do is we want to be able to rock. Now, sorry, I'm just gonna. So I'm sitting in a swivel chair, and this kind of rocking is much less intimidating to a child than this kind of rocking. Because if you just do that, you will feel in your head, your brain going back and forth, and you will feel much more kinesthetic inputs into the body by this vertical rocking as opposed to the horizontal swivel. So if your child doesn't like rocking, then you're going to start with the horizontal swivel, and you're going to do that during play. So these things are all to help your child down-regulate. Once your child is back to in the yellow box, then we can talk about what just happened in terms of a disciplinary issue. We talk about what happened, we make sure that they understand what happened, why it happened, the impact on other people. And, you know, when you did that, I feel like you used lots of I statements. I felt very upset. I felt what you said hurt my feelings. Oh, I'm sorry, Gran. Okay, so then we're done. And we don't have to have consequences that carry on for hours or days. And so how do you upregulate? So your child has been frightened and has shut right down and gone into the closet and doesn't want to look and doesn't want to respond. So again, we're going to use touch. We might also use movement like the rocking. We might also say, so if your child, sometimes in a therapy session with older children or with adults, they'll start to zone out and dissociate. And I'll say, okay, stand up, touch my hands, stand up, you know, movement, right? So we'll do some large movement to get them to come back into the here and now. So when people are shutting down, we can use movement. We can push against walls. We can push against each other. We use large muscles. We can put cold water on our face, cold cloth on the back of our necks. We can use joyful play, start tossing balloons, pushing, you know, pounding balloons back and forth. The yoga ball is great. Here, catch. And we can upregulate, roll around on the yoga ball, to put on some music that's uplifting and sing uplifting, right? So we now have this idea that we can regulate our child, and we're going to use different things for every child. So I ask parents to kind of make lists. What do I do to upregulate and then it works? What do I do to downregulate and it works? Keep the list handy. So that's therapeutic parenting. You have to do these different things to get your child back into that yellow area where they're regulated. And then once they're regulated, you can use language now and talk about what happened. The consequences usually are interpreted, I'm bad and you don't like me, you're mean. So consequences, especially in the early days of an adoption, are very risky. They might work. And the more healed your child becomes, it's easier to say, you know, look at, you swore at me again today, so there's no iPad tonight. You know, that's just going to be our rule. Swearing means no iPad. Okay, swearing means you have to do the dishes for me. So once you get past a lot of this stuff, and there's a relationship and there's attachment and there's some security and trust, then you can just start saying, okay, whoever used their cell phone at the table, you're on dishes. and these things will work at that point. Okay. And so here we come to this difficult part, and this is one of the most difficult things for adoptive parents, is that when you adopt a child who has an attachment problem, it means that it's hard to parent them. But not only is it hard to parent them, it's also hard to love them. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. And it's true because it's actually an innate process. I talked about this in the first webinar. Attachment behavior of the child elicits or brings out the parental bonding behavior. That's how it works. Attachment behavior, the adult mammal, does nurturing behavior. If the attachment trauma in the caregiving relationship in the early years means that attachment behavior had to adapt to that maladaptive, harmful relationship. So basically, bad parenting means bad attachment behavior, simply put. So then you take the child out of that relationship and put that child into a new relationship. Now this child has really dysfunctional attachment behavior, and this new parent has great bonding behavior, but the child doesn't know how to respond to it, and the child doesn't respond to it so well. And so then the parental bonding behavior isn't being taken up, it isn't being reciprocated, it isn't being welcomed. And so it starts to wither. And so then adoptive parents are working really hard to keep their bonding behavior going and going and going in the face of pushing away, rejection, you're horrible, I don't want you. These things can happen periodically. And, you throw a birthday party, the child melts down, screams, runs from the table, and you go, why did I bother? And so it sometimes feels like everything that you do, everything that you pour in gets thrown back at you or dumped on the ground or just leaks away somewhere. And so we have to really actively support parents to keep going in the face of the lack of response to the child, because the child will only respond if the parent keeps doing. And it's actually the reverse order, right? It's supposed to be that the attachment behavior elicits the appropriate bonding behavior from the parent, and as the child grows, the parent changes, right? However, now the parent has to do it without all the right cues, and it's just really harder. And until it starts to work, and then it's just amazingly joyful. And sometimes it changes like that. The child gives over and says, "Oh, I really can trust you. You're really not going away." And so then, sometimes it just happens all at once, and sometimes it just happens slowly. Yeah. So we want to make sure that you know where to go for resources. My website is maryjoland.ca, and under the tab When We Are Very Young, there's the video series, and there's an entire webinar on the window of tolerance, and an entire webinar on that the bidirectional window. I don't know what else to call it. I got to come up with a name for that thing. So that XY axis, I don't know. If anybody thinks of a good name, let me know. And so there's the videos there really on that specifically, and there's 10 other videos. So Pathways course, if you're an adoptive parent and you have your adopted child in your family now, you can take the Pathways course and just go to the Adoption Council of Ontario to look at the courses that are being offered starting in, I think there's one in the summer, and they'll be starting again in the fall. There's, and the Adopt4Life newsletter always lists the Pathways courses. If you are working with professionals and you feel like they could benefit from being more adoption competent, you can refer them to the Adoption Competency Training for Professionals at the ACO. And if your teachers are struggling with helping your child appropriately in school, you can refer them to the ACT Educators Workshops, which are coming up in the fall. Sorry?
Sorry, I was going to say, it was through the Pathways course I was parenting for a couple of years, but it was through Pathways that I really got to understand developmental trauma, and I highly, highly recommend Pathways to any parent. Even take it again, because you get different things out of it, and it's free, and they at times provide childcare, and you get fed. So why wouldn't you go? So that's my plug for Pathways through the ACO. It really was a game changer for me personally.
And I would recommend any of the books by Dan Hughes and John Balin. Attachment Focused Parenting is a really great book by Dan Hughes. And if you're really struggling, Brain-Based Parenting by Dan and John is an excellent, excellent book. It really explains why, if your child is not giving you attachment behaviors, it explains why your bonding behavior will shrivel up, because it's a midbrain process. It's something that, you're supposed to do instinctively, more or less. And if your instincts aren't being triggered by a nurturing, seeking infant or child, then you don't have anything triggering it. And so you have to really work hard to do it. On my website, I have my favorite top 15 books, I think. It's really important, if your child has any sensory processing problems, to see an occupational therapist, because that will send them into high arousal. And you'll never get out of high arousal unless you sort out the sensory processing problems. So sometimes I go in and I see that a child is sensory dysregulated, and I'll say attachment therapy can't start until this child's been assessed by an OT and that the sensory work is starting. Because we'll never get that regulation, that arousal level down in order to build the attachment. And really, it's important to have a good assessment. And I think that's it. Please ask any questions or comments. Please ask away.
This was amazing. We have about 15 minutes or so. So if people have family-specific questions, or if you felt something wasn't covered that you're itching to ask, please feel free. I feel like you were talking about my family half the time during these. It's very interesting to see it all on paper as well. And I can definitely relate personally to the parenting side of it and how hard that can be. So question, is anyone teaching therapeutic parenting? So we learn about why, but need help with how to do it ourselves at home day to day.
Yeah, so I think that that's the topic for number 3. We really have to have the theory before we can really understand what we're doing. So I think a really great way to do that would be to have some actual scenarios. And I would be super happy if people would email. You're welcome to email me through my website. There's a contact me on my website. So all you need to know is my name, Mary Jo Land, just no E on the Jo, one word, .ca. And if you want to email me a scenario, I'd love to have like 5 scenarios or so of children of different ages, children that have been in the home different amounts of time, and to say, this is what we're stuck with. And I know that one of the things that I will say right off the bat is that if children are not sleeping properly, we'll never get anywhere. So sleep is my number 1 question at the beginning. How's the child sleeping? If they say fine, we move on. They say this child just never sleeps, they wake up all the time. Say, okay, well, that's where we need to start. Because they will, again, like the sensory processing issues, they will never have a reasonable arousal level through the day if they're sleep deprived, and their brain will not be functioning very well if they're sleep deprived. They will be irritable. They will be too much in negative, that negative side of that emotional x-axis. There'll be too much negative affect if they're sleep deprived. So sleep is essential. And I am absolutely for parents being present in the night for their children, whether that is a mattress in the child's room or whether that is a mattress in the parent's bedroom. You can't do that until the child is on AP, I guess. You can't do it with foster children, have the child in your bedroom. But I guess once the child's on AP, I think it's okay. Maybe not till it's completed. Social workers don't like you to have kids in your room, but we're the only mammal that does that, by the way. So why are we doing it? I don't really know. But to have the child, to be able to be present with the child if they're waking up, and so that their fear is instantly resolved. I'm right here, honey. It's okay. And then they can go back to sleep quickly. That's pretty much the only way that they're going to learn to sleep properly. And if that doesn't work, then I would be talking to the doctor about, what can we use to help this child get into a sleep pattern. We need days of, weeks of good sleep and to see a change. And sometimes children are having a small dose of melatonin for a couple of weeks, and they get into a sleep pattern. Once they've got a couple of good weeks of sleep, then they're able to do it on their own. But it's essential, absolutely essential, that they're sleeping well. And then the next question is about eating. If they have eating problems and they're constantly hungry, again, we won't get that arousal level down. So we look at the biology and the sensory piece first to get the arousal levels down. And we work on that first, and then we start. And again, that's therapeutic parenting. You're aware of the therapeutic issues of this child, and not just parenting them like any other child who has a non-developmental trauma history. Those children can be parented in a fairly straightforward way most of the time. But the children who have developmental trauma, we have to always be looking and thinking and understanding. It's important that you have it's really important that you have a clear history of where the child was when. What was happening during my child's brain development? And so that kind of information is essential to get. And sometimes we don't have it. Children who are, kind of left at an orphanage door when they're a year and a half old, in Ethiopia, for instance, will never know what happened. We'll never know what they experienced. Oftentimes kids coming from the child welfare system, sometimes we don't know what's happened in their lives. We only know the events that brought them into care. We might not know really much about what happened before that. So we have to make good guesses based on how they function, what might have happened in their lives. Yeah.
So we have 2 questions. I'm just cognizant of time as well. First one, what happens if, this is my life. What happens if one of the children has a nightmare and keeps you up and you have to work the next day?
So it is really, parenting and working is really, really a struggle. So I have this mathematical formula that I use, that the parenting capacity, like, what skills you have and what knowledge you have as a parent, plus your supports, has to be greater than the child's needs. So if you don't have supports around either getting more sleep at some point during the day, or having someone who is spelling you off through the night, some nights you do it and some nights you don't have that kind of support, your child's needs are going to start being greater than your capacity, and your capacity is going to drop, right? So that simple equation, that the parent's skills and capacity plus all of their supports has to be greater than the child's needs. That capacity, that equation has to be fulfilled all the time. So if it's not working, get supports, because that's the quickest and easiest thing to do, is get supports. And I say that it's the quickest and easiest thing to do. It's not. It's just quicker and easier than the other 2. You can't instantly change parent capacity, and you can't instantly change the child's needs. So, asking a neighbor to come in and babysit while you go and take a nap, that might be the quickest support that you could get, right? But if you're in that zone where you're up at night, that probably means that you're going to have, a couple of times a week, someone who comes in and gives you a spell to go and have a nap, so you get caught up in your sleep.
Yep. Okay, so just the last question then. Our adult daughter, as previously mentioned, has severe anxiety due to multiple traumas. Is she at risk of passing trauma onto her child? She talks about how empathetic she is. How empathetic he is, the grandchild, and he's 3.5, and how he recognizes her stress and reaches out to calm her.
Right. So there are 2 things that we don't want parents to be. We don't want them to be frightening, and we don't want them to be frightened. So when you think of attachment security, that what that security means is that the parent is a secure base upon which the child can stand and grow. I think of it as Canadian Shield, huge, strong, immovable. We never have earthquakes on the Canadian Shield, right? So huge, strong, immovable, and like rock solid. And that's the ground on which the child stands in order to grow up. And that ground doesn't shake, and that ground is there and available all the time. That's the perfect scenario. It's never like that all the time for anybody. But like that's the vision that we want to have. So if the parent is anxious, then the child is learning that the parent is frightened about certain things, and that maybe the world isn't that great a place, and that my parent may not be able to keep me safe. That, oh, maybe I'll have to keep my parent safe. And that role reversal isn't very healthy for the child. That parent's got to be the one to stand on the Canadian Shield, not to become the Canadian Shield for the parent, right? So it's probably a very good idea for that mother to have some help, some psychotherapy, to help her to reduce her anxiety and to be more sure of herself while she's parenting, and to be able to learn some skills to put some containers around things and put some boundaries around her feelings, and to say, oh, today is a day where I have a lot of anxiety. Maybe this is the day where the child's going to be in the nursery school, and that I'm going to be doing what I need to do to look after myself. And I would suggest that mom reads or watches the African grandmother story, because she needs to meet her needs before she meets her child's needs, because otherwise he'll start meeting them.
That's my favorite story of yours. That absolutely is. Okay, I think that is all the questions we have, and we're wrapping up anyways. If we finish the webinar and you realize that you completely forgot to ask the question or you weren't comfortable, please reach out to me. I'll make sure that Mary Jo or someone from our mental health committee is able to answer your questions, because we want to make sure that you are getting the support that you need. Just in response to what you were saying about the adoptive for the grandmother, she said, thank you, that has been my concern. I think I can raise it with her with love and compassion. That's amazing. Perfect. Okay, perfect. So that is it. I'm going to be wrapping this up. Yes, like I said, if you realize that you forgot to ask a question or you wanted to reach out personally, please feel free to do that. If there's other resources that we can support you with in accessing, whether it's actual psychotherapy with Mary Jo or connections with pathways in your region, we're more than happy to help you with that.
There's also Nurturing Attachments at George Hull, which is an excellent program for people who are really struggling.
That's really great.
Yeah.
That's Etobicoke, right?
Mm-hmm.
Etobicoke, perfect. Okay, so it's a great resource as well. See, we're constantly learning. Perfect. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and you're just going to see our faces pop up. So thank you, everybody, for attending, for joining in. Mary Jo, we're taking your evening away. And we really appreciate everything that you continue to do for all of us. Wendy, yes, I will send you that resource as well. So I'm logging us all off. I hope you all have a great evening, and we will keep you informed for when part 3 will be coming out. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.